Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us again. Our show is about our veterans and their stories. My name is Shirley, and I'm happy to present to you today our Vietnam veteran, which is a very dear friend of mine. We worked together for a long time, and his name is Ed Retta. And Ed, I'd like to start off by finding out a little bit more about your time in the service and to tell the viewers your story, basically your story. So let's start off by finding out, were you drafted or were you enlisted?
No, I was drafted.
Okay. And what branch of the service were you in, Ed?
U.S. Army.
And what rank were you?
When I got out, I was a E5.
And for people that don't really know, what exactly is an E5?
Well, basically a sergeant.
Oh, okay. Now, you told me a story about when you were drafted that President Kennedy had just been assassinated. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on that for me.
Unfortunately, 8 days after President Kennedy got assassinated, I did receive my draft notice. And I went into the service then about 2.5 months later, in the early part of 1964 in February. And I was then stationed at Fort Dix here in New Jersey for my basic training.
And how long did you train at Fort Dix?
Actually, I stayed at Fort Dix for about 3 months because I did my basic training there, and I also did um, a second part of that. And then I had to go down to South Carolina to do what they could considered at that point guerrilla warfare training.
Okay, so guerrilla warfare training, what does that mean? What does that consist of?
It sort of makes you ex- understand what it's going to take to be in combat in jungles and in weather and so forth that you are not used to here on the east coast of the United States.
So, how long does that training usually last?
About 2 months.
And I know the country was in turmoil, and there were people that were opposed to the war, and some people were for the war. So, maybe you could guide us a little bit through that time and what it was like, while you were being drafted, what was happening at home here.
I guess it was early part of the war because of the fact that they weren't exactly sure where and when we were going to really consider it a war. So what happened was the 101st Airborne Division was commissioned to go to Vietnam in February of 1965, at least half of it. So 4,000 of the troops went early at that point. And I think that's when it really was considered a war. Before that, they weren't quite sure. And so I think the people weren't really against it until sometime later in 1965 and 1966. And in early 67, they called the rest of the 101st Airborne Division into Vietnam.
So, you were in that airborne division.
Yes, I was. I was considered a consultant for a while, and I helped set up the whole area along with about 200 other guys to help bring in the 4,000 people in the division.
I know you mentioned to me about the fact that you were considered a consultant. So, can you tell me and tell everybody what exactly does that mean?
Well, for the first month and a half, we had to wear a, a uniform that was not, they called it a civilian uniform. You had to have civilian clothes because there were times where we weren't going to be working as a soldier, we were going to be working as a consultant. That stopped in December of 25th, Christmas Day of 1964. President Johnson said that it no longer was going to be consultants. We were getting, people were losing their lives. And so as of January 1st of 65, it became a war.
So, what was it like when you arrived in another country and tell us a little bit about how things it became.
Well, as we know, there were monsoons, which is incredible amounts of rain, and the heat was pretty bad. So that sometimes you had pouring rain for days and days, and it would be in the 90-degree temperatures. So it was not something that growing up on the East Coast of the United States that you were sort of used to. So it took a lot of, I think that that's part of why the training happened for several months before we got there to help us try to deal with that kind of weather.
So, coming from the United States and the first days of your service and being in a foreign country, you went directly to Vietnam?
No, I was in part of the time I was in Kentucky at Fort Knox, and then I was stationed in South Korea for a while because they wanted to put us together. So people came from many of the areas, whether it was Europe, the United States, and stuff. And the first battalion that moved into Vietnam in October of '64, we had come from South Vietnam at that point.
Okay. And here's a picture I know that you have, if you want to hold it up. And that was you.
This is me, I guess, within the first week or so that they take your picture when you go into the service. So you have an identification picture.
Okay, so this was your ID picture. And I think there's another picture of you here that we talked about. Maybe you could explain this one.
Uh, this one is myself and one of the other Army guys who I knew for a while. And this, at the end of my service, with a month and a half to go, they didn't know where they wanted to put me because they only had 6 weeks left. So they put me back in Fort Knox to train the officers in how to deal with war within the tanks and how to fire some of the weapons in a tank. And this picture was taken on the last day that this other Army guy and myself were in Fort Knox, Kentucky, before we left to go to the airport to come home.
And then this particular picture of you here.
Actually, this one was done in Fort Dix in March of '64 after I finished basic training. And a buddy of mine who I knew for many years was a lieutenant in the Air Force, and he came to say congratulations that I had finished basic training, and he took me up in an airplane, and it was the first time I ever flew in a plane in March of 1964.
So you spent some time in boot camp. Do you have any memories of boot camp? Anything funny? Maybe something that happened? Any pranks?
There's always lots of funny things in boot camp because no one really has the idea of what they're doing yet. And of course, some of it is very serious because even in boot camp, you get shot at with real guns going under wires and fences and things like that and crawling in mud. And so there's always lots and lots of fun and not such good food.
Okay, that's another subject to go on. Uh, well, what kind of food did you eat when you were there?
Everybody has to go to the same place to eat, and then when you're trying to feed several hundred people at the same time, a little tough to be really special food. So it's just eat what you can, eat what you want or don't want, but just eat.
Well, what foods in particular did they give you?
They actually gave you everything that you needed as far as whether it was, to drink water or drink milk or something of that effect and have vegetables and everything. It's just that the way they were cooked and they weren't very good. So the sauce wasn't very good and everything else, but you ate it because you were going to do a lot of work.
Did you have the opportunity to eat much Vietnamese food when you were there?
Took a while. It's certainly not used to the Vietnam food, and in many areas, basically, what we still did in Vietnam in the '60s when I was there, we still were eating sea rations from World War II. Sea rations come in a can. You have to open the can and you eat whatever is in that can. And in the can is just about everything you can think of, from bread to beans to meat and everything. And it was what they call sea rations, and it was from World War II.
So the sea rations must have had a long shelf life.
Well, they had a lot of things in them to keep that way. We'll leave it at that.
And what was your job assignment like, Ed?
After being a consultant, I was in what they call special weapons, and can't talk too much about what those were, but they were. I helped even the Green Berets. I was not in the Green Berets, but I did help the Green Berets set up some of their things that they were doing in Vietnam early on, and teaching some of the guys what we called special weapons.
So it's not something you really can discuss then.
No, I really can't discuss it in total. No.
Okay. Right. And did you see a lot of combat when you were out there?
Yeah, obviously a lot of combat. Lots of guys didn't come home. Lots of guys were in the hospital and so forth and so on. I was hurt a couple of different times during my stay, but the good news is I came home to see my family.
So how were you hurt?
Mortar fire once and rifle fire once.
And did you have somebody there to help you?
Uh, yeah, the medics were pretty good in the helicopters. They came in and got us pretty good, so we were very lucky to have them.
And tell me about some of the friends that you met when you were there.
Well, you get to meet people from all over the country, so it really does. You being a New York City kid, I got to see people from Alaska, Hawaii, California, and Texas, and everything else. So you learn a lot about the other cultures from the other states as well. So and you make camaraderie. Unfortunately, not everybody came home, but still have a few friends.
So did you stay in touch with the friends that you made out there?
Unfortunately, the two that I was very close with are no longer with us. They left us a couple of years back.
And what would you say was maybe one or two of the most memorable experiences that you had during your time?
Well, I'll tell you a quick funny one about eating because we talked about it before. When I was helping the Green Berets, the captain asked me if I had eaten that day, and I had said no. And he said, you need to eat something. And I said, yes, sir. I said, maybe I'll have something later. And he went, now you're going to have something now. And he went over and he took his bayonet out and he went over to a lizard and he cut the lizard and said, here. And I said, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. And he said to me, that's okay. You will tomorrow. And sure enough, tomorrow came and I hadn't eaten again. And he did the same thing. And I wound up eating a lizard, almost alive.
So so the reason you ate the lizard was because there wasn't much food?
There wasn't any food. If you didn't, don't forget, you would have to carry the ones that were in a can and stuff. And of course, there wasn't really restaurants around that you went to go get any food from.
So did you make friends with people that were from other countries as well?
Not a lot, because in the early part of Vietnam, there really wasn't too many other people from other countries. Most of the people who you met in the army, so obviously from all different cultures, whether it was Polish, German, Italian, Irish, Scottish, but not from the countries, just from backgrounds that the people had.
Now you also have a pair of boots that you want to show me. So why don't you take the boots out and tell us a little bit about this story?
When you go in the army, you get four of these. I got these two later on because they have steel toes. And in the 101st Airborne Division, when you jump out of plane, the toes being steel do help because you could drag your foot and you're not going to have it all crashed up and everything. So these are still there. My name is still in them. And my name is in the boot along with my number. And there's one of the memories that you have.
But they're in great shape.
Well, because I didn't use these as much as the ones that I don't have anymore because they got destroyed.
So, what was it like jumping out of an airplane? Tell us about that.
It takes a lot of training, and some of the guys crash out, they don't go. But I sort of enjoyed it. So it's never a fun thing, but I always sort of liked it.
And how did you keep in touch with your family back then?
You wrote letters. And the funniest thing that I will tell you real quick is that my mother had baked cookies and sent them to me. And for 4 months, I never got them. And she would send another letter. Did you get them yet? Did you get them yet? And finally, I got the box that she had sent 4.5 months before. When I opened the box up, it looked like sand because the cookies were all crashed and the guys were eating them like they were the best things they ever had. And I thanked my mom even when I came home that the guys loved it. That was one of the top things we ate in Vietnam, cookies that were all crushed.
So, it took 4 months to get the cookies to you.
4.5 months that I finally got them.
I wonder why it took so long.
Well, you don't have an actual address when you're in a war sometimes, so you move around a lot.
And how about supplies? I know you mentioned about, eating, wild animals out there, but were you people, did you people have enough supplies?
Again, a lot of the time when you were out, you had to deal with having the sea rations because, and some of the guys actually taught you how to eat flowers, believe it or not. And there were some flowers that were okay to eat and some not. But it wasn't like you could sit down and have a meal 90% of the, well, let's say 70% of the time you had to just eat what you could.
So, whatever you could find.
It was Vietnamese or a lot of the towns would offer us food, and a lot of times you didn't even know what you were eating, but you ate it.
And how about water? Was there supplies of water that you could get as well?
Difficult. One of the real problems with the water there was it tried to. They always gave you pet like things that you put in the water to make it clear, but a lot of times you'd run out of it. And one of the guys showed me a thing which I thought really worked well in Vietnam, and I'm sure a lot of the other guys as well. In the rice paddies, bamboo grew, so you could hold a bamboo stalk and pull it out and cut off the top of it. And if you turned it over, you could drink about 2 or 3 gulps of water that comes out of it, and the bamboo actually would filter it.
Interesting. And you told me that the boots that you had to walk through the rice paddies with those as well.
Yeah, that wasn't fun because it's leather. So, but back in that day, they didn't realize that the rice paddies were things that you would have to walk through. So you didn't have any kind of special boots. You had to walk with the ones with the leather. So it became a problem for a lot of guys.
So, what would happen if you wore those leather boots and did your feet expand in them, or what had occurred?
What happened really is they used to call it jungle rot. The skin would actually come off. So one of the things that all of the officers would tell you all the time, make sure you have your ammunition and make sure you have a couple of different pair of socks that are dry so you could change every once in a while. Otherwise, you really could have problems and wind up in a hospital.
So, was there something special that you would do for good luck?
Not a lot, actually, because it really didn't seem like there was a lot of good luck. And anybody who was in Vietnam will tell you that a lot of the kids used to do something that I didn't think was too smart, but marijuana grew pretty much wild in areas of Vietnam. And so a lot of people would do that, which didn't make a whole lot of sense in a war.
Now, you also told me another story earlier that you were, I believe it was something to do with Agent Orange that occurred.
Well, as we all know, Agent Orange became a real problem later on. It was a good idea because walking through the rice paddies, the Vietnamese used to hide in the jungles, which were at the end of the patties, and try to knock off the soldiers. So what they decided to do was take down some of the jungle so they wouldn't have that kind of thing. And they used Agent Orange, which, you know, seemed like a great idea, except for the fact that they didn't go into it and make sure that it wasn't poisonous, which it turned out to be. And so it killed a lot of guys as well.
So, how did you entertain yourselves when you were there? What did you do?
Not much. Sleep if you can. And most of the time, you wound up sleeping in a tree and you wrapped your ammunition belt around you because you couldn't find a dry place to lay down on the ground.
So, where did you go on leave? Did you have leave time?
Yeah, probably the best one in my life. I was on R&R, rest and recuperation. So I was on leave, and I was in the Saigon airport, and an officer comes up to me and says, "Where are you going?" I said, "I don't know, sir, anywhere out of here." And he said, "Good, come with me and put this flight suit on." And he was a major. He said, "Don't talk to anybody. If they want to talk to you, tell them to come and talk to me." We put the flight suit on. We went out, got in an F-14 fighter, and we went off. And I had never been in a jet before, so the G's were really incredible. And about 10 minutes into the flight, I said to the major, I said, "Major, where are we going?" He goes, "I don't know where you're going. I'm going to Japan. Where do you want to go?" I said, "I don't know. What's around here?" He goes, "How about Hawaii?" And he literally and figuratively dropped me off in Hawaii, right on the runway, didn't go anywhere. I got out of the plane and he took off in 10 seconds back to go to Japan. Greatest day of my life.
But he picked you up again, right?
No, I asked him that. He laughed. He said, "No, that one's on you."
So, how did you get home? How did you get back?
In those days, and it may even be today too, but in those days, as long as you were in Class A uniforms, you could fly in any airline for free.
And speaking of uniforms, we have Ed's uniform.
Well,
So I
it's one of the jackets that are considered a work jacket. It's a field jacket. So it was actually given to me in February of 1964. And I guess this was at the end because the patch, it's my E5, but the patch is from,
this
um,
particular patch here.
no, the one on the left shoulder it is.
Okay, let's
And
show
again, it's what I did early on, and it's the armor school at Fort Knox that I was put back in for the last 6 weeks. And again, at the last 6 weeks, I trained officers how to drive and use tanks to blow things up and stuff.
And is there another patch on here as
No,
well?
just the U.S. Army one.
Oh, the U.S. Army patch. So this is your actual jacket then?
Well, the holes in it sort of make it pretty much old. Yes, it is the jacket that I wore to do field duty.
And do you have any, excuse me, funny stories that you might recall, even from boot camp or from?
I'll tell you just one quick one, and that was oh about 3 weeks after the 101st Airborne Division came to Vietnam. A young boy, about 17 or 18 years old, from somewhere down, it was either Tennessee or South Carolina, and we were out, and we were actually getting fired on by mortar rounds. And the kid asked me where the bathroom was.
Oh no.
And I said, "Well, I'm not sure which one you want, but any of those trees is pretty good." And I think till today that was one of the funny ones.
Now I know you told me that you didn't have a camera there, because back then the cameras would have been really large. But did you keep any diaries or personal accounts?
I did for a while, but unfortunately, I had moved to California in the '70s, and I had a fire, and it really destroyed quite a few of the things that I had, along with not j- even stuff from school, degrees that I've had, and so forth. And a lot of my army stuff was unfortunately lost as well. I don't have it anymore.
So, do you recall the day your service ended? Tell us a little bit. That must have been a happy day for you.
We took that picture that I showed you before, went out to the airport in Louisville, Kentucky, and there were 4 or 5 other guys there. And one of the other guys said, you know, where are you from, Ed? I'm from New York City. And I said, where are you from? He said, I'm from Los Angeles. And we started talking. We had a drink at the bar. And he said, Ed, why don't you come with me for a couple of days? You don't, it was March. I'm sorry, it was February. He said, it's going to be cold in New York in February. So guess what? I got on a plane with him and we went out to LA and I spent 3 days out in Los Angeles with them. And again, we flew for free because you could do that back then.
So, what did you do in the days afterwards?
I really had to take a couple of weeks, in fact, a few months to actually get physically better because I still wasn't in 100%. The government asked me to re up so I could stay in the service and be helped. But I had people in my life who were very close relatives who were doctors and surgeons who said that they would help. So I came home and I sort of recuperated for the next month and a half before I really did anything. And then I started to work. About 2 months, 3 months later, I it was with a company called Union Carbide at that time.
You told me a story, funny story earlier about um, you being enlisted and your age. So, I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know if it was funny, but it was strange because of the fact that I was already 22 years old and finished with college when I got drafted. And that was a little bit unusual back in that day. Even till today, no one's real sure why. I did meet a few other people who were like it. I think probably they were thinking that if they could get us college guys in drafting and they sent us to advanced infantry, which is what you had to do to get to officer training school, that a lot more guys would become officers. And they were probably right. The percentage did go up, but I didn't want to take that. I wanted to just come home.
But one of the funny parts that you mentioned to me was the younger guys. What did they call you?
Well, because I was 22 years old, the younger guys did call me the old man. So uh, even though I had hair, what can I tell you?
And again, just to go over, did you make any close friendships? Would you say?
I did, but you know, you didn't. None of them were close to me, like in New York or anything of that nature. So the truth is that you didn't stay very close to them, or at least I didn't. I tried to get that out of my life and do something different.
Even the men that you were with in California when you got out?
Yeah, we stayed in touch for a while, but then that was it.
Now, fast forward, and for later years, did you join a veterans organization, Ed?
Well, I go to the VA all the time because I have things medically that I have to do on a monthly basis. So I do, and I volunteer at the VA, and I belong to the American Legion and so forth and so on. So I do stay connected.
Okay, we have some pictures here. Okay. And this one I'd like you to talk a little bit about because this one's a little bit older. So tell us about that one.
Now, this one was taken about 6 years ago, I guess, on Memorial Day. The town I live in, Bedminster, has is connected to Far Hills, and there's a parade that goes on for Memorial Day. And this is me at the memorial for the Vietnam veterans and so forth. And I have two blood cousins who were on the wall, so brings back a lot of memories.
And then more recently, you have some other pictures here.
This one is just from about 2 years, 3 years ago, and this is where I live in Bedminster. And again, I'm, I guess, the oldest Vietnam guy, and I walk on the parade. the memorial in front of me is the Vietnam Memorial, and I laid a wreath there every year for Memorial Day.
And I think that other picture is of you marching, if I'm
Same,
not
yeah,
mistaken.
same one, marching in a parade. And unfortunately, as we all know how life is, that is me. And the gentleman next to me is, uh, he's not a Vietnam vet, he is a Korean vet. And unfortunately, he's not with us anymore. He left us about 2 years ago.
And this picture.
This one is
Okay.
sort of quite unique. You guys know the Patriots baseball team,
The Somerset Patriots.
Somerset Patriots. This was taken at the Somerset Patriots. They invited 50 of us veterans, along with the colonel, who is a Medal of Honor winner. And they did a great job, and all the stuff that they put, chairs out onto the field. And I got to meet this colonel who's a Vietnam veteran and has the Medal of Honor, and I knew him in Vietnam, and it was amazing that we met for the first time in over 50 years. Well, it was 50 years ago. This was 2 years ago that we did this. So it was the first time we actually touched base with one another in 50 years. It was good to see him.
But are you guys staying in touch with each other, Ed?
Well, no, he doesn't live here. He lives in the Midwest. He was invited to come to, so we could all meet him, if you will.
Great. I hope you keep in touch with him because that's amazing that you ran into him again.
50 years later, yep.
Do you attend any reunions at all?
I don't, because I get to see so many of the veterans at the VA that I go to every month, and then I volunteer, like I said. So I see it. I get to see a lot of veterans.
So, how did your experience affect your life now?
Good question, except that I'm not sure. um,
Well, it must be a difference because if someone was not in service, their life is going to be a much different than what you've been through and what you've actually experienced and seen.
I guess that I guess that's true in a lot of ways. However, as most veterans will tell you, if you can get over the the hard part in your brain and everything else, and your physical side, you try to do things that are fun in life. I got married. I have a family, and try to keep the army and the wars off to the side a little bit rather than as part of your life.
Now, have you visited the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C.?
Yes, and plus they had at the Duke farms in where we live, that they have the traveling Vietnam Wall, and that was about 3 years ago. That was also here.
And did you find any of your friends on the wall?
Like I said, I have two cousins that are on the wall.
And did you find them?
Yes. Yeah.
So, I think in conclusion, I'd like to find out from you, Ed, that is there anything maybe that you can think about that maybe you'd like to add that we didn't cover?
No, I think everything is very good. I just wish that, like most veterans, that all these wars and everything could come to an end, but I'm not sure that's going to be.
Okay, well, I really want to thank you, Ed, for being on our show today. And, I thank you as a veteran, and I thank all our veterans for service, for your service, for what you've done for this country. And, you know, we really appreciate that. And I'd like to say that if there's any other veterans out there that would be interested in being on this show, please get in contact with us on TV 35 because we really would like to hear your story. And, we thank you all. And God bless America.
Thank you.